They cut the power to my $750,000 lake cabin just 47 hours after I moved in, while I was live streaming to 200,000 viewers. Standing at my door with a smile that made my blood boil was Audrey Montgomery, the HOA president who thought she could force me out by any means necessary. What this power-hungry tyrant never expected was that I'd been documenting powerful people for 20 years, and she just handed me the opening scene of what would become her worst nightmare. When the dust settled, her empire would crumble, and my counter-lawsuit would make headlines across the country. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, because I'm about to show you how an HOA that shut off my cabin's power unknowingly triggered their own million-dollar downfall. The cabin at Pine Lake had been my sanctuary for exactly 47 hours when everything went dark. After 3 exhausting years documenting corporate corruption for my last Emmy-winning film, I had used my savings to purchase this peaceful retreat in Wisconsin. The real estate agent had emphasized the pristine water views, the healthy fishing population, and the tight-knit community. What she conveniently failed to mention was that this community was under the iron rule of Audrey Montgomery, a 65-year-old widow who ran the local Homeowners Association like her personal fiefdom. When I arrived with my collection of cameras, lights, and editing equipment, I had no idea I'd soon be using them to document my own battle against someone who made the Wall Street executives from my last film look like amateurs in the art of intimidation. That first night, I was setting up my workspace when the cabin plunged into darkness. No warning, no flickering, just instant darkness, and the suddenly loud sound of wind across the lake. I checked my phone and confirmed I'd paid every utility bill. The account was active and in good standing. That's when the knock came at my door. Standing on my porch, in the beam of my flashlight, were 2 figures. A tall, severe-looking woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair, and beside her, a balding man in his late 50s wearing what looked like an unnecessarily formal suit for a late-night house call. "Mr. Bennett," the woman said, with a thin smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm Audrey Montgomery, president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. This is Warren Phillips, our vice president. We've had to temporarily suspend your electrical service due to violations of Section 5.2 regarding unauthorized outdoor equipment and electrical safety concerns." I was stunned. "You cut my power? On what authority?" Audrey held up a document bearing the logo of the local utility company, showing the HOA's right to request service suspension for safety reasons, based on some special agreement with the power company. Warren pointed at my security cameras and motion sensors. "Those devices aren't approved by the architectural committee. At Pine Lake, we have a communal security system. Your equipment compromises the aesthetic standards of our community and violates Section 8.3 regarding exterior appearance guidelines." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Audrey's smile widened slightly as she added, "Perhaps you should reconsider whether this property is the right fit for you. If you're interested, I know several buyers who would offer a fair market price." I tried explaining these were basic security devices, but Audrey dismissed me with a wave of her hand. "In this area, we have our community security protocols. We don't need everyone installing whatever technology they fancy. It disrupts our carefully maintained ambiance." Warren handed me a business card for a real estate agent. "Give Diane a call. She can help you sell without losing too much on your investment." As they turned to leave, Audrey added over her shoulder, "Until then, I suggest you familiarize yourself with the HOA bylaws, the full 300 pages. The threat was clear: comply or suffer. Later that night, as I sat in my cold cabin using a small emergency generator to power essential equipment, I noticed a figure watching from the shoreline. When I stepped outside, he quickly approached, a tall man in his mid-40s with a camera slung over his shoulder. "I'm Garrett Sullivan, your neighbor 3 cabins down," he said, extending his hand. "I saw what happened. Audrey's been doing this for years." He explained how the HOA had pushed out 4 homeowners in the past 2 years alone using similar tactics. "They'll hit you with a noise violation for that generator tomorrow. Probably $2,500, same as the Johnsons last year. It's all in Appendix D of their environmental sound regulations." Sure enough, the next morning I found a violation notice on my door citing noise pollution with exactly that fine amount, referencing the same appendix Garit had mentioned. I spent the day reviewing my purchase documents and HOA regulations, discovering numerous vague clauses that could be exploited against virtually any homeowner. My documentary filmmaker instincts kicked in and I began recording everything, every interaction, every notice, every conversation with neighbors. That evening, Garrett stopped by again, this time with more troubling information. "They want your land specifically," he said quietly, glancing around as if Audrey might be hiding in the trees. "Your cabin sits on a key location for some big development project they're planning." I remembered Audrey's oddly eager offer to buy my property on the very first day. It was starting to make sense. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't be intimidated into selling a property I'd worked years to afford. I'd spent my career exposing abuses of power. I wasn't about to become a victim of one. I called an old friend from my university days. "Tessa, Noah Bennett here. I need legal advice, and possibly a new story. I think I've found the subject for my next film." As I hung up, I glanced out toward the lake and caught sight of Audrey standing at the shoreline, watching my cabin through binoculars. Instead of feeling angry, I picked up my camera and smiled. "Thank you for the first shot, Mrs. Montgomery," I said to myself as I began filming. "If this were a scene in a movie, the light from the lake right now would be the turning point for the main character." Tessa Winters arrived at my cabin the next morning, her legal pad already filled with notes. After graduating from Harvard Law, she'd built a reputation defending individuals against corporate and institutional bullying, exactly the expertise I needed. She examined my documents while I explained the situation. "They absolutely cannot legally cut your power," she confirmed, underlining a passage in the utility company agreement. "This clause only applies to common areas and demonstrable safety emergencies, not to private residences simply installing security cameras." She shook her head in disbelief. "They're using the HOA as an illegal intimidation tool. It's a classic tactic to force homeowners to sell." The more neighbors I interviewed, the clearer the pattern became. Anyone who didn't fit Audrey's vision for Pine Lake, whether because of their profession, appearance, or willingness to question her authority, became a target. The tactics were always the same: fabricated violations, excessive fines, utility interruptions, and eventually, pressure to sell for the good of the community. I installed a temporary solar power system to keep my essential equipment running, documenting every move the HOA made against me. When Warren spotted my solar panels, he nearly tripped over himself, rushing back to report to Audrey. By that afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting had been called about the aesthetic threat posed by renewable energy equipment. Garrett introduced me to Brooke Anderson, a biologist at the local university who served on the HOA board but clearly wasn't in Audrey's inner circle. Initially, she was hesitant to speak with me. "I'm not talking to some tabloid filmmaker looking for scandal," she said dismissively when we first met. But when I showed her maps marking soil samples secretly taken around the lake, her demeanor changed instantly. "How did you get these?" she asked, suddenly alert. "I discovered unauthorized soil testing months ago, but my complaints were ignored. I was even threatened with having my research funding cut when I pushed back against a previous development proposal." Brooke explained that she'd moved to Pine Lake specifically to study its unique ecosystem, only to discover that Audrey and her allies seemed determined to commercialize the area, regardless of environmental impact. The conflict escalated rapidly. Audrey called an emergency HOA meeting about the security threat of my filming activities. A new regulation was hastily approved banning recording activities for commercial purposes within the community, a rule clearly aimed specifically at me. When I attempted to interview a friendly family down the shore, I found myself surrounded by Audrey's loyal HOA members, who formed a literal human barrier between us. The intimidation tactics grew more brazen. I received an unexpected fire safety inspection notice from the local fire department, which coincidentally found numerous questionable violations in my perfectly safe cabin. A neighbor named Tom Baker, who had initially been friendly, suddenly began reporting that I was filming children, a malicious lie that I later discovered earned him a promised position in the management of whatever new development was being planned. Through it all, I found myself wavering. One evening, sitting alone by the lake, I questioned whether this fight was worth it. "Maybe I should just find somewhere else," I told Tessa when she called to check on me. "Somewhere without an HOA." Her response was to quote my own words from my previous documentary: "Silence is complicity with the oppressor." She was right, of course. I hadn't built my career by backing down when powerful people tried to silence me. Still, I hadn't come here looking for a fight. I'd been seeking peace, not another battle. The internal conflict weighed on me as heavily as Audrey's external pressure. The situation reached a new level when I received an official notice that the HOA was suing me for endangering the community under Section 7.4 of their bylaws, demanding $150,000 in damages and my immediate departure from Pine Lake. Tessa reviewed the lawsuit and smiled. Actually smiled. They just made two critical mistakes, she said. First, Section 7.4 only applies to common areas, not private property. Second, by suing a documentary filmmaker, they've just legally given you the right to investigate everything about them. I set up my main camera on its tripod and pressed record. Let's call this new film The HOA Queen and Her Crumbling Kingdom, I said. Cameras don't scare them, Tessa. The truth behind the cameras is what terrifies them. While Tessa prepared our legal counter-strategy, I launched into full investigative mode, digging into Audrey's background and the history of Pine Lake HOA. What emerged was disturbing. Property values that mysteriously plummeted just before certain approved buyers purchased them, homeowners driven out through systematic harassment, and increasingly strict regulations that seemed designed to give Audrey near absolute control. Tessa filed motions questioning the relationship between the assigned judge and Audrey, discovering they had been golf partners for years. Meanwhile, I interviewed former residents who had been forced to sell, building a powerful case documenting systematic harassment. Audrey's response to my investigation was predictable but still shocking. While I was out interviewing a former resident, she organized a surprise inspection of my cabin, damaging some of my filming equipment in the process. What she didn't know was that Garrett had helped me install a sophisticated surveillance system that captured everything, clear evidence of trespassing and property damage. Tessa filed formal charges, forcing the reluctant local police to investigate, despite their obvious ties to Audrey's circle. Furious, Audrey called a special HOA meeting to vote on my expulsion for disrupting community harmony, a vote that passed despite Brooke's passionate objection that no such power existed in the HOA charter. The pieces of the puzzle came together when I discovered the connection between Audrey and Pinnacle Resorts through public documents. Her son was the company's vice president of development. Brooke, who had become an unlikely ally, accidentally encountered him at a university fundraiser and overheard his phone conversation about a key location and closing the deal within 60 days. When Tessa received notification that the judge had voluntarily recused himself from our case after evidence of his relationship with Audrey was submitted, I knew we were gaining momentum. I edited my first footage into a 15-minute trailer about the conflict and shared it with trusted colleagues. The response was immediate. A producer from a major streaming service contacted me. We're very interested in this project. Let us know if you need any support. The most surprising development came when Warren Phillips called me late one night. I need to meet with you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There are things you should know about Audrey and Pinnacle. I'm not betraying anyone, but I'm not going to prison for her either. As I hung up, I couldn't help but feel that the documentary I had reluctantly begun was about to take a dramatic turn. The story wasn't just about saving my cabin anymore. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had been strangling this community for years. The best stories find you, my old film professor used to say. This one had definitely found me. By cutting my power on a cold Wisconsin night. When I met Warren at a diner 20 miles from Pine Lake, his choice, Audrey has eyes everywhere, he explained. He didn't fully switch sides, but strategically revealed information to protect himself. Pinnacle Resorts has been planning a $500 million luxury development for 2 years, he said, sliding a folder across the table. They need to acquire all properties in the lakefront section to build their flagship resort. Inside were partial internal documents showing Audrey receiving substantial consulting fees for each property acquisition, plus a promised executive position at the new resort upon completion. She threatened to have my law license revoked if I didn't clean up the NOAA problem, Warren admitted, fear visible in his eyes. I'm giving you enough to save myself, nothing more. Back at the cabin, I organized a small screening for concerned homeowners, sharing my findings and evidence. The reaction was immediate, shock, followed by anger, then determination. Audrey, feeling the community slipping from her control, hired a private security firm to monitor me 24/7 and dig for compromising information. Her smear campaign escalated, spreading rumors that I was making adult films at my cabin, a ridiculous accusation that nonetheless gained traction among some of the more conservative residents. The financial pressure was mounting too. Between legal costs and living without proper utilities, my savings were dwindling. One night, I confessed to Tessa that I needed money to pay off debts from my previous film. I didn't expect to be fighting a legal battle, I admitted. The streaming services pay well, but not until the project is complete. Brooke discovered that Pinnacle's environmental impact reports had been falsified to conceal the development's true effect on the lake ecosystem. Their own internal assessment shows it would devastate the water quality, she explained, showing me documents she'd obtained through academic contacts. They're planning to dredge parts of the shoreline and remove the wetlands that filter the water. As more homeowners began openly supporting my investigation, the community divided sharply. Tom Baker, who had reported me for filming children, led a group of Audrey loyalists in a mock protest outside my cabin. My cameras caught them receiving cash payments from Audrey's car, evidence that would prove invaluable later. The escalation continued relentlessly. Tessa filed for a restraining order against Audrey after documenting multiple instances of harassment. In response, Audrey lobbied local officials to declare my cabin a public nuisance. The local newspaper began covering the conflict, initially portraying me as a troublemaking filmmaker disrupting a peaceful community. The negative press nearly broke my resolve. Maybe this isn't worth it, I told Garrett one evening as we watched another sunset from my powerless cabin. Even if I win, half the community will hate me. He pointed to the children playing by the shore. If Pinnacle builds here, none of this will exist anymore. It won't be a matter of who likes you. There won't be a community left at all. Everything changed when a former Pinnacle employee contacted me through my website. I was fired for questioning ethical practices, she explained, providing internal emails that explicitly outlined the plan to use the HOA to pressure homeowners into selling, with a deadline of just 48 hours to finalize the remaining properties. Tessa immediately finalized our $1 million countersuit against both the HOA and Audrey personally, charging harassment, property damage, and conspiracy to defraud. The streaming service confirmed they would fund the project and provide additional legal support, significantly strengthening my position. Sensing the walls closing in, Audrey made an unexpected visit to my cabin with a final offer: double the market value for my property in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. I invited her in, ostensibly to discuss terms, but with cameras rolling. "You know, Mrs. Montgomery," I said casually as she detailed her offer, "the subjects in my documentaries often dig their own graves. Thank you for contributing this valuable scene." Her face froze when she realized she was being recorded. "You won't win against me," she spat, losing her composed facade. "I built this place. I have all of them in my pocket." The footage was priceless. Audrey, in her own words, admitting to corrupting local officials. As she stormed out, I knew we had reached a turning point. The documentary wasn't just documenting the conflict anymore, it had become a weapon in the fight itself. The most disturbing discovery came when investigating Audrey's finances. Not only had she received kickbacks from Pinnacle, but she had been embezzling from the HOA fund for years, using the money to renovate her own mansion and fund exotic vacations. When Tessa filed our formal countersuit with all the evidence we'd gathered, it created a statewide sensation. Pinnacle Resorts, fearing the growing scandal, issued a statement denying any improper activities with the HOA. My 15-minute preview film about the situation went viral online, quickly reaching over 1 million views. Homeowners called an emergency meeting about Audrey's use of their funds for her personal legal battle, creating yet another front in her rapidly collapsing defense. Audrey tried desperately to discredit the evidence, claiming everything was fabricated and that Warren had betrayed the community. Warren, feeling threatened, continued providing information piecemeal to secure his position. Brooke organized a group of environmental scientists to oppose the development, drawing additional media attention. Garrett discovered Audrey secretly contacting a cybersecurity company to attack my online accounts, a desperate move that showed just how cornered she felt. Some newspapers began attacking me, calling me a professional provocateur seeking attention and a failed director, making me worry that I might lose the public relations battle despite having truth on my side. The situation reached critical mass when a cybersecurity team attacked my website and cloud storage accounts, attempting to delete evidence. Fortunately, I had anticipated such a move and maintained secure backups, even tracking the attack to its source. Audrey attempted to lobby high-level officials to intervene in the case, but the media attention had grown too intense. At the preliminary hearing, Audrey arrived with an expensive legal team, projecting absolute confidence, while Tessa and I appeared outmatched. Outside the courthouse, media had divided into two camps, with some reporters calling me an opportunist and a attention-seeking failed director. It was exactly the kind of David versus Goliath moment that makes for compelling documentary storytelling, except I was living it rather than filming it from a safe distance. The preliminary hearing began with Audrey demonstrating complete confidence, unaware that we were about to play our trump card. After her lawyer's opening statement painting me as a troublemaker trying to gain fame by disrupting a peaceful community, Tessa calmly approached the bench. Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to submit evidence that was just made available to us. She played an audio recording of a meeting between Audrey and Pinnacle representatives discussing how to push out remaining homeowners within 48 hours to secure the missing parcels. The courtroom fell silent. Warren, who had been subpoenaed, confirmed the recording's authenticity, causing Audrey to visibly pale. I looked directly at her across the courtroom. "This is exactly what happens in every documentary I make," I said quietly. "The moment when the truth becomes undeniable." As Audrey left the courthouse, she faced a crowd of angry residents and reporters. Turning to me, she hissed, "You have no idea what you've started." "I still have cards to play." I smiled at the camera I was holding. "I think it's time to show Mrs. Montgomery the third act." The judge ordered a full investigation into the HOA's financial activities and suspended all actions against my property pending resolution of our countersuit. That evening, local television stations led with the story, the narrative having completely flipped from troublemaking filmmaker to local hero exposing corruption. It was surreal watching myself become a character in what felt increasingly like one of my own documentary narratives. The following days brought dramatic developments. Pinnacle Resorts officially withdrew from the development project and terminated all connections with Audrey to salvage their corporate image. The HOA held an emergency meeting where numerous members demanded Audrey's immediate resignation. The State Financial Investigation Agency opened an inquiry into Audrey's management of HOA funds over the past 10 years. Through it all, I continued filming, documenting the HOA's collapse and restructuring under new leadership. Audrey, desperate to shift blame, attempted to make Warren and other allies scapegoats, creating even more division among her remaining supporters. Warren continued providing information piecemeal about past illegal transactions to secure his partial immunity deal. Brooke was nominated as interim HOA president, pledging comprehensive reform and transparency. This placed me in a difficult position. Should I pursue the lawsuit to its conclusion, potentially bankrupting the HOA that served the very community I'd come to care about, or accept a settlement that would benefit everyone? The question tormented me, especially given my own financial pressures. The settlement would clear my debts and fund my next projects, I admitted to Tessa one evening as we reviewed our strategy. But if I sign their NDA, the full story never gets told. She understood my dilemma, but reminded me, this isn't just about your cabin anymore, it's about stopping this from happening elsewhere. Audrey's desperation became increasingly evident. She attempted to destroy evidence by shredding HOA documents, but Garrett caught her in the act and filmed it. At the next court session, all evidence regarding HOA finances and their relationship with Pinnacle was made public, creating a wave of indignation throughout the community. Audrey's lawyers proposed a settlement, but with the condition that I sign an NDA and abandon the documentary. It was a tempting offer, financially. Enough money to clear my debts and secure my next few projects. But accepting would mean the full story would never reach the public, and the pattern could continue elsewhere with different players. After a sleepless night weighing my options, I made my decision. Standing before the court, I declined the settlement offer. Money can buy silence, but it can't buy light. I don't make films for money. I make them to tell stories that need to be told. Audrey, in a final desperate move, organized a press conference, accusing me of fabricating the entire story for my film project. What she didn't know was that I had prepared for this, releasing new footage just as she was speaking, causing reporters to check their phones and murmur among themselves. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. In the middle of her denials, law enforcement officers appeared with a warrant for Audrey's arrest, on charges of embezzlement of HOA funds and financial fraud. As Audrey was led away in handcuffs, she stumbled, frantically trying to push cameras away from her face. The contrast with her previously immaculate, controlled image couldn't have been more stark. I watched the scene unfold, my own camera capturing every moment. "I've made many films about justice," I said quietly to Garrett, who stood beside me, "but I've never seen it happen in real time like this." I should thank her for the opening shot and the closing one. Tessa smiled, watching the officers place Audrey in the police car. "We have our ending now." I lifted my camera to capture the final moments. "And I have the best credit sequence I've ever shot." The aftermath unfolded rapidly. The court ruled overwhelmingly in favor of the homeowners, awarding $1.2 million in damages from Audrey's personal assets. The local news, which had initially portrayed me as the villain, now celebrated the documentary filmmaker who saved Pine Lake. Warren, with his partial immunity deal, began a new life in another state. still carrying the guilt of his complicity. Brooke faced challenges from conservative residents resistant to change, but her scientific background and clear vision for environmental protection gradually won over even the skeptics. As for me, I found myself at a crossroads, with numerous offers from major film studios interested in my next project. With the court case concluded and my cabin's power finally restored, I could have simply returned to my original plan, finding peace and inspiration for my next documentary, but the experience had changed me. Using part of the settlement money, I established a foundation to help homeowners abused by predatory HOAs across the country. The documentary, The HOA Queen, was acquired by a major streaming platform and became a national sensation, sparking discussions about HOA reform in state legislatures. Former residents who had been driven out held a reunion at my cabin, planting trees and rebuilding the dock as a symbol of community healing. Through it all, I kept filming, documenting not just the conflict but the reconciliation that followed. The legal momentum shifted dramatically in our favor when Tessa filed our formal countersuit, backed by the mountain of evidence we'd accumulated. Local media that had initially been hostile began running investigative pieces on Audrey's history of intimidation. Pine Lake HOA president faces $1 million countersuit, read the headline of the county newspaper that had previously portrayed me as a troublemaker. The article detailed allegations of embezzlement, harassment, and conspiracy with Pinnacle Resorts. Public opinion was turning, but Audrey's influence still ran deep. She retained expensive crisis management consultants who worked to reframe the narrative as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by an attention-seeking filmmaker looking for his next project. I continued editing footage from the ongoing conflict, adding interviews with former homeowners who shared strikingly similar stories of intimidation. When I released another preview segment online showing the pattern of abuse, it received over 2 million views within days. The comment sections filled with people sharing their own HOA horror stories from across the country. What had begun as my personal battle was clearly resonating with a much wider audience. Tessa leveraged this growing public interest to secure depositions from former HOA board members who had been silenced by Audrey's intimidation tactics. One by one, they came forward with accounts of being pressured to approve increasingly restrictive regulations and questionable financial decisions without proper oversight. Audrey's response was to escalate her attacks on my character. Anonymous accounts appeared online claiming I had a history of manipulating footage and fabricating narratives in my previous documentaries. Professional critics who had previously praised my work suddenly published scathing reappraisals questioning my ethics and methods. I knew Audrey was behind it, but proving it would be nearly impossible. The stress was taking its toll. I lost weight, struggled to sleep, and questioned whether the fight was worth the personal cost. "They're trying to break you," Tessa observed during one of our strategy sessions. "This is exactly what they've done to everyone who stood up to them before." But unlike those previous victims, I had the tools and platform to document and expose the tactics being used against me. The HOA held an emergency meeting about their rapidly depleting legal fund, which Audrey had been using primarily for her personal defense. Many members were outraged to discover their dues had been diverted without proper authorization. Brooke challenged Audrey directly, presenting financial records that showed hundreds of thousands of dollars unaccounted for over the past 5 years. "This isn't about one cabin or one homeowner anymore," she told the assembled members. "This is about whether we want to be governed by transparency or intimidation." Audrey responded by calling for Brooke's removal from the board for disloyalty, a motion that failed when several previously loyal members abstained, showing the first major crack in Audrey's power structure. Warren continued providing information piecemeal, careful to protect himself while giving us just enough to strengthen our case. His latest revelation was particularly damning. Documents showing Audrey had personally selected which homeowners to target based on their property's strategic value to the Pinnacle development, with her son's input on which parcels were most critical. "There's a timeline," Warren whispered during our latest clandestine meeting. 48 hours to close the remaining deals or Pinnacle walks away. Your cabin is the linchpin. They can't build the main lodge without that location." The urgency explained Audrey's increasingly desperate tactics, but also gave us a critical advantage. We only needed to hold out for 2 more days to derail the entire scheme. The situation escalated when Audrey's allies on the local zoning board suddenly scheduled an emergency hearing to reclassify my property as a commercial use due to my filmmaking activities, which would trigger numerous additional regulations and potential fines. Tessa filed an emergency injunction, but we knew the board was firmly in Audrey's pocket. Our strategy shifted to delay. We needed to postpone any decision until after Pinnacle's deadline expired. Garrett helped organize a group of supportive neighbors to attend the hearing and raise procedural objections that would stretch out the process. Meanwhile, Brooke contacted her university colleagues to prepare testimony about the environmental impact of the proposed development, adding another layer of complexity that would require time to address. The most shocking development came when my entire website was hacked, defaced with false confessions about fabricating evidence, and my cloud storage accounts were compromised. Fortunately, I maintained offline backups of all footage and documents. Tessa's digital forensics consultant traced the attack to a firm regularly employed by Pinnacle Resorts for reputation management. The attack backfired spectacularly when we filed criminal charges for the hack, drawing even more media attention to the case and forcing Pinnacle to issue another statement distancing themselves from any illegal activities related to the Pine Lake situation. Their stock price began to drop as investors questioned the company's ethics and the viability of the development project. As the preliminary hearing date approached, Audrey seemed increasingly unhinged. During a chance encounter at the local grocery store, she cornered me between the produce aisles. "You think you're so clever with your cameras and lawyers," she hissed, eyes wild with fury. "But when this is over, you'll never work in film again. I have friends in places you can't even imagine." I remained calm, aware that other shoppers were watching the confrontation. "Mrs. Montgomery," I replied evenly, "everything you're doing is exactly what I document in my films. Power abused until it self-destructs. The only question is how much damage you'll cause before it's over." She stormed off, but not before several witnesses had captured the exchange on their phones. Another piece of evidence showing her true nature. The day before the hearing, I received an unexpected visit from Audrey's son, who arrived in an expensive car with tinted windows. Unlike his mother, he was calm, professional, and direct. "Pinnacle is prepared to offer you $1 million for your property, no questions asked, no strings attached, except a standard NDA about the negotiations. You can continue your documentary, finish your film, do whatever you want. We just need that parcel." The offer was tempting. More than tempting, it was life-changing money, far more than the cabin was worth. When I hesitated, he added, "My mother doesn't know I'm here. This is strictly business, separate from her methods. This offer expires in 24 hours. After he left, I sat on my dock for hours, watching the sunset and weighing the decision. The money would solve all my financial problems, fund my next several projects, and I could simply find another cabin elsewhere. That night, I called Tessa to discuss the offer. "It's your decision," she said after a long silence. "Legally, it's a clean offer, but you should know that tomorrow we're going to present evidence that will likely result in criminal charges, regardless of whether you sell." I thought of all the former residents who had been driven away, all the current homeowners still living under Audrey's reign of intimidation, and the pristine lake that would be forever changed by development. By morning, my decision was clear. I declined the offer and prepared for the hearing that would determine not just the fate of my cabin, but the entire Pine Lake community. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning of the hearing. Audrey arrived with 3 attorneys from one of the state's most prestigious law firms, dressed immaculately and projecting absolute confidence. In contrast, Tessa and I sat alone at our table, armed with nothing but a laptop and file folders. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had replaced the recused judge, called the court to order. Audrey's lead attorney presented their case first, painting a picture of a harmonious community disrupted by an outsider with an agenda. "Mr. Bennett is not a typical homeowner," he argued smoothly. "He's a professional filmmaker who saw an opportunity to manufacture drama for his next project, regardless of the damage to this community's reputation." When it was Tessa's turn, she approached the bench calmly. "Your Honor, rather than tell you what happened, we'd prefer to show you." She played the audio recording of Audrey's meeting with Pinnacle executives, discussing their strategy to pressure homeowners into selling within a 48-hour deadline. "As you can hear, this isn't about community standards or regulations. It's about forcing people from their homes for corporate profit." She then called Warren Phillips to the stand. Under oath, he confirmed the recording's authenticity and detailed how Audrey had systematically targeted homeowners whose properties were most valuable to the development plan. With each revelation, Audrey's composed facade cracked further until she was visibly seething at the defense table. The judge took only a brief recess before issuing her preliminary ruling. "The court finds sufficient evidence to suspend all HOA actions against Mr. Bennett's property pending full resolution of this case. Furthermore, I am ordering a complete forensic audit of the HOA's financial records for the past 7 years. She looked directly at Audrey. "And given the seriousness of the allegations, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation." As the courtroom erupted in murmurs, I caught Audrey's eye across the room and saw something I hadn't expected. Not just anger, but genuine fear. For perhaps the first time, she realized she might actually lose. Following the hearing, developments accelerated dramatically. Pinnacle Resorts issued a press release announcing their withdrawal from the Pine Lake project, claiming community resistance made the development no longer viable. What they didn't mention was that their 48-hour deadline had passed without securing the necessary properties, primarily because of our legal challenge. The company's stock dropped 11% as investors questioned management's judgment. Meanwhile, HOA members called an emergency meeting where dozens of homeowners demanded Audrey's immediate resignation. When she refused, they voted to freeze the HOA's legal fund, cutting off resources for her defense. Desperate to regain control, Audrey called a press conference to denounce me as a manipulative outsider who had fabricated evidence against her to advance his failing career. What she didn't know was that I had timed the release of new footage showing her trespassing in my cabin and damaging my equipment to coincide exactly with her press event. As reporters began checking their phones during her speech, the questions suddenly shifted from sympathetic to when asked about the new evidence, Audrey lost her composure entirely, shouting, "Those cameras were illegal. He had no right to record me." The outburst effectively confirmed her guilt on live television. The final blow came unexpectedly. As Audrey struggled to regain control of the narrative, police officers entered the press conference with an arrest warrant. The State Financial Crimes Unit had fast-tracked their investigation after receiving our evidence and found sufficient cause to charge her with embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of HOA funds. Watching her being escorted out in handcuffs, stumbling and frantically trying to shield her face from cameras, was surreal. This woman who had terrorized an entire community for years was suddenly reduced to just another subject in a perp walk that would feature in news broadcasts across the region. "I've documented justice in many films," I said quietly to Garrett as we watched the scene unfold, "but I've never witnessed it happening in real time like this. I should thank her for the opening shot. And the closing one." Tessa smiled beside me, her expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal vindication. "We have our ending now." I raised my camera to capture these final moments, knowing they would form the powerful conclusion to what had become much more than just a personal fight. And I have the best credit sequence I've ever shot. In the days that followed, the full extent of Audrey's corruption came to light. The financial audit revealed she had embezzled over $300,000 from HOA funds, using the money for luxury vacations, home renovations, and personal expenses while claiming they were community improvements. Former board members came forward with stories of intimidation and blackmail that had kept them silent for years. Warren, while not completely innocent, cooperated extensively with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. Brooke stepped into the role of interim HOA president, facing the enormous challenge of rebuilding trust and establishing transparent governance. I found myself at a crossroads. With Audrey facing criminal charges and the development plan abandoned, I had essentially won my battle. I could simply return to my original plan, enjoying my cabin and working on independent film projects away from the spotlight. But something had changed in me through this process. The hundreds of messages I'd received from homeowners across the country facing similar intimidation made me realize this story was much bigger than Pine Lake. "This isn't just about one corrupt HOA president," I told Tessa as we discussed next steps. "It's about a system that enables these abuses everywhere." When Audrey's attorneys approached with another settlement offer, this time with no restrictions on my film but a substantial financial payment to avoid further civil penalties, I faced my most difficult decision. The money would clear my debts and fund my projects for years. After a night of soul-searching, I called Tessa with my answer. "I'm declining the settlement. This story needs to be told completely with all the consequences intact." She wasn't surprised. "I thought you might say that. The good news is, the streaming service has doubled their offer for the documentary rights. They think this could be the next big true crime sensation." The civil case proceeded to trial, where the jury took less than 4 hours to return a verdict in our favor, awarding $1.2 million in damages to be paid from Audrey's personal assets. As the judge read the verdict, I felt no triumph or satisfaction, only relief that a long, draining battle was finally ending with justice served. Outside the courthouse, Reporters asked how it felt to win. This wasn't about winning, I told them, camera still in hand. It was about documenting the truth. The real winners are the homeowners who can now rebuild their community without fear. 6 months after Audrey's arrest, Pine Lake was transformed. Under Brooks' leadership, the HOA underwent a complete restructuring, with new bylaws emphasizing transparency, accountability, and environmental protection. The massive legal fund that Audrey had accumulated through excessive fines was repurposed into a community improvement program, funding a new public dock, playground, and nature conservation area along the shoreline. Former homeowners who had been forced out under Audrey's reign were invited to join a class action lawsuit and received compensation from her assets. Warren, with his partial immunity deal, relocated to Arizona but still carried the weight of his complicity. In a handwritten letter sent from his new home, he expressed regret for his role in the scheme while thanking me for forcing a reckoning that was long overdue. My documentary, The HOA Queen, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival before being acquired by a major streaming platform for worldwide distribution. The film became an unexpected cultural phenomenon, sparking national discussions about HOA reform and homeowner rights. I received thousands of emails from viewers sharing similar experiences across the country, many asking for advice or help with their own HOA conflicts. Using part of the settlement money, I established the Homeowner Advocacy Foundation, providing resources and legal support for those facing abusive practices. What had begun as a personal fight for my cabin had evolved into a mission I never anticipated but now embraced fully. The most meaningful moment came when the former residents who had been driven away organized a reunion at my cabin. Families who hadn't seen each other in years gathered on my property to share stories, plant native trees along the shoreline, and rebuild the community dock that had fallen into disrepair under Audrey's neglect. "You saved more than your cabin," an elderly man told me as we worked side by side setting dock posts. "You saved the spirit of this place." Watching children play in the same waters that had nearly become a construction site for a luxury resort filled me with a sense of purpose I'd rarely felt, even when winning film awards. Audrey's criminal trial concluded with a guilty verdict on multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of HOA funds. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison in order to pay restitution to all affected homeowners. Her final statement to the court showed no remorse, only bitterness. "I dedicated my life to maintaining standards and excellence at Pine Lake," she insisted. "Everything I did was for the good of the community." The judge was unmoved, noting that the evidence showed her actions were motivated by personal gain and a disturbing desire for control over others. As she was led away for the last time, our eyes met briefly. There was no triumph in my heart, only a filmmaker's curiosity about how someone could become so corrupted by power and so blind to their own transformation into the villain of the story. Brooke faced significant challenges in rebuilding community trust. Some conservative residents remained skeptical of her leadership, viewing her environmental priorities with suspicion. I filmed a remarkable town hall meeting where she patiently addressed concerns from Audrey's former supporters, gradually winning them over with her transparency and willingness to listen. "We don't have to agree on everything," she told an older resident who had voiced concerns about changing too much too quickly. "But we do have to respect each other's right to be heard. That's the difference between before and now." Watching her navigate these difficult conversations with grace showed me that the story's third act, the healing after the conflict, was perhaps the most important part to document. My own path forward became clearer as the documentary gained recognition. I received numerous offers from studios interested in my next project, including several wanting to dramatize the Pine Lake story as a limited series. Instead, I chose to focus on a larger investigative work examining HOA abuses nationwide, using the foundation to support homeowners willing to share their experiences. The cabin that had been the center of so much conflict became both my home and a creative retreat, where other documentary filmmakers could work and find inspiration. The solar power system that had so offended Audrey now powered an editing suite where young filmmakers could develop projects focused on social justice and environmental issues. The most unexpected resolution came when several state legislatures, prompted by the attention my film had generated, began drafting homeowner protection acts to limit HOA powers and require greater transparency. I was invited to testify before committee hearings, sharing the evidence we'd gathered about how unchecked HOA authority could lead to systemic abuse. One senator remarked during a hearing, "Sometimes it takes a filmmaker to show us what's been happening right under our noses." The idea that my work might lead to lasting structural change was more satisfying than any award I had ever received. 1 year after Audrey's arrest, Brooke organized the first Pine Lake Transparency Festival, celebrating the community's renewal with music, food, and educational workshops about environmental conservation. I was honored as a special guest, though I felt somewhat uncomfortable with the attention. "I didn't fix anything," I told the gathered residents. "I just documented what was happening. You all did the hard work of rebuilding." Later that evening, as families gathered for a lakeside concert, I received an email from a homeowner in Florida inviting me to investigate their HOA's suspicious activities, a potential sequel that would have to wait for another day. Each evening, as I sit on my small dock watching the sun set over the peaceful lake, I can't help but reflect on the journey that brought me here. I bought this cabin seeking tranquility, only to find myself in the middle of a battle. But perhaps that's what I needed, not just for myself, but for this community. Sometimes the most beautiful homes are built from the ruins, and the strongest communities emerge when people stand up for what's right. If this were a scene in a film, the light on the lake right now would be the perfect final image, the visual resolution to a complex story. Audrey cut my power, but she inadvertently switched on a much greater light, and with over 5 million viewers of my documentary, I'm eager to share whatever project comes next. Special thanks to all of you who stood with me on this journey. And Mrs. Montgomery, if you're watching this from prison, thank you for cutting my power. It was the smartest decision you ever made for my career.